Awesome. Okay, so I'll let people in for you, but feel free to send me a message or just ask me a question if you need something. But I'm gonna eat, so I'm gonna hide myself.
Bon appetit.
Yes. All right, folks. So welcome to one of the first sessions on the Heat Cognition Project. I'm gonna let them get started so they got their full time. So take it away. I'm excited to hear more about it.
Thanks so much, Erin. I'll start with the classic. Do you see my screen?
Yes.
Can you see the presentation? Yeah,
Yes.
perfect. All right. Yes. Hi, everyone. My name is Mona. Kim and Celina are also in this call. You can already see them. And we're going to present the Heat and Cognition Project, which is a project that we're currently, a ManyLabs project that we're currently organizing. And just for a bit of the time scope, so we are kicking off this project now, or we have been kicking off the entire year, more or less, let's say the starting points. And then the data collection for this project has not started yet, but it will start with 2026 and run throughout the whole year. As you will see why throughout the presentation. But just for a little heads up, like where we are in the project. So it's an ongoing research project. So what is this about? So we know, we know climate change is happening, and we also know it's affecting us as humans, and we as humans are affecting the climate. So a lot of research in environmental psychology so far has happened on this side, right? So how do we change human behavior, and how do humans impact climate change? And also, of course, the question, can we change human behavior actually to be more pro-environmental? And Kimberly has been leading this big team science project that you probably have heard of in addressing climate change with behavioral science, the intervention tournament, to test different interventions for behavior change. So as you can see, a lot of research has already happened in understanding how we can change human behavior to be more pro-environmental. But what we don't know so well so far is how does climate change actually impact us as humans in our cognition, in our social behavior, decision making, and all of this. And this is very much where the Heat Cog project, as we call it, is located. So we are interested to understand how climate change, and in particular heat waves related as climate hazards, impact us as humans. So when we're talking about heat, we're interested in, okay, what do we already know about heat effects on the human mind, on, for example, human cognition? But the problem is actually, if you look into the literature, we do not know enough. So problems with prior research is that there are various ways of how to actually define what is heat, what does hot or heat exposure mean. Then there are various outcome measured. It can be task-based. If you, for example, measure cognition, there are classic tasks to measure this cognitive performance, but you could also think of behavioral observations. There are a lot of studies that use self-report. And then there's also a very narrow focus of individual studies in very specific settings and with very specific samples. And this also comes with methodological constraints in the original studies. Just to give you a bit of an overview. So for example, we were looking into the literature, looking of heat effects and the different studies that are cited very often, or used very often to define what and how far heat impacts the human mind. And as you can see, the dependent variables that they're measuring sometimes are kind of strange. The sample sizes are I would say outdated in today's methodological standards. So samples are often very, very small and often are very specific. So for example, only male students or only male military personnel. So basically, our research wants to overcome these constraints and use a ManyLabs approach to overcome these constraints on a big scale. So our idea is to understand how exposure to extreme heat impacts different facets of human mind and human cognition, which is cognitive performance. So how well do people perform in these classic cognitive tasks? Then social functioning, that is, for example, something like aggression, but also social value orientation. Climate beliefs and policy support. So in how far does, for example, belief in climate change under exposure to extreme heat, and how much do people support certain climate policies? And psychological well-being. So how what are the psychological effects on the human mind from exposure to extreme heat? So these are all the different facets of the human mind that we want to look at. And we also want to understand in how far does vulnerability of individual people and like the context in which people are moderate these effects from exposure to extreme heat. As we assume that for some people, the exposure to extreme heat will lead to much stronger effects because they are, for example, more vulnerable and are also in a less adaptive, have less adaptive capacity. So how do we want to look at this? We actually want to look at heat and use heat waves in a natural experiment design. So we're interested not only in how exposure in like in a small moment of extreme heat, but rather a heat wave as an experience that people have in their real life and how far this impacts human cognition. So we will have 40 cities worldwide where we will collect 2,000 participants in this natural experiment design where we have both a control condition and an extreme heat condition that are dependent on the temperature in the different locations. We will do this in a 3-wave design where we have both a control wave before the extreme heat condition and a control wave after the extreme heat condition. In the first control condition, we will acquire 500 participants in a not too hot but also not too cold control temperature, so average seasonal temperature. And in the extreme heat condition, we will acquire 1,000 participants that will fill out our questionnaire during a period of extreme heat. So basically, we are tracking heat waves around the globe. And then when a heat wave hits or when an extreme heat period hits in the different cities, then will be our extreme heat condition. And after that time period passes, with a bit of a time lag between them, there will be a second control condition, also during an average seasonal temperature. Note that this means that we're employing a between subjects design. So we will compare similar groups between the control and the heat condition. We will use market research panels to make sure that these are also matched for example, age and gender. And the whole project is conducted as an open science and open source project. So where do we collect data? First of all, we decided to focus only on urban conditions, which we mainly do because heat is actually a much bigger problem in big cities because of the urban heat island effect, and also because we have much better data about temperature and heat waves in these urban locations. And we also have like a constrained area where the heat wave is happening. So we did a quite extensive analysis of all big cities around the world to identify which cities, especially in the last 4 years, have faced several heat waves, and therefore also like basically defined the probability for these heat waves for these cities to also face heat waves in the next year. And then also we matched this with where we found collaborators and people that were locally available and willing to join our project, and then decided for 40 cities worldwide in which we will collect data mostly during 2026 and then depending maybe also 27. Please know that the data collection phases will of course be very different for each of the locations because the data collection phase depends totally on when the heat waves will hit, because we will only collect data during extreme heat periods. We're very happy and excited that we already have over 250 collaborators that are on board and are also allocated to these different cities, and will overall have the aim to target about 75,000 participants. You can see here the blue coloring of this graph also shows you that we have cities in different parts of the world that also face a different vulnerability to climate change, which is also something that we're very interested in. So which tasks do we plan to include? We did a full task tournament that was pre-registered to decide. So people from our collaboration were able to suggest which kind of task and scales they want to see measured in our questionnaire. And then we pre-selected them and then did a voting by popular vote, which kind of measures they would want to see included for these 4 main categories. As you can see, it's quite a lot. We have been working and struggling with the questionnaire quite a bit, but we're about to finish it. As you can see, we measure different facets of cognitive performance, social functioning, climate beliefs and policy support, and psychological well-being. In addition to that, we will also assess different aspects of vulnerability, including sensitivity, through factors like gender or household type or existing health issues or adaptive capacity, which is, for example, the access to air conditioning, different housing conditions that people live in, their access to green and blue spaces. And then, of course, we will also measure exposure to extreme heat. So both the zip code level heat and humidity data, but also a subjective perception of the temperature. And I will now hand over to Celina, who will talk a bit more about the methodological challenges of studying heat exposure and climate-related aspects in such big ManyLabs project.
So much. Do you want me to share mine then?
As you like, I can also go on for you, but with the animations, maybe it's easier.
No, it's okay. I'll share on my end. I think it'll make it easier to.
Yeah.
All right. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right. So let me just reduce the screen here. Strange, it's giving me an error on mine. Anyway, okay, so basically, next to presenting our project, we also wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about what challenges we face in studying specifically heat exposure as a climate phenomenon, and how these might be solved. And maybe after we're done with the presentation, we can discuss a little bit together how we can address some of these challenges if you have any ideas. So the reason that we want to focus on sort of climate-related phenomena is that they are very qualitatively different from a lot of other independent variables that are studied in sort of big team science or in big collaborations. And this is not just the case for sort of heat exposure, but also for many other climate phenomena like wildfires or floods or maybe earthquakes and so forth, that they are very lived, very variable, and very tied to the place. So what that means is every place and every individual in the context that they're in might be exposed very differently to the independent variable. So the first challenge, and we'll present 5 today, is defining extreme heat across different climate zones and regions. Because there's no universal temperature threshold that defines extreme heat. This has been a problem both in the literature, that in the climatology literature, there is still no consensus about what extreme heat really means, what heat waves really means. And that has basically the decision to use absolute or relative thresholds has very different implications. So the former, the absolute thresholds risks overestimating exposure. Like if you, for example, imagine a place like Delhi that faces degrees over 30 degrees relatively often, people might be much better adapted to hotter conditions than, for example, in a place like Oslo in Norway, where it's very, very rare. So we might find different effects if we decide on an absolute, let's say, cutoff of 32 degrees. There is also the problem with relative thresholds, which is that it makes comparisons across sites very difficult. If we use a relative sort of threshold of 29 in one and of 35 in another, then how can we compare these locations? So what we've decided on for now is a calibration to local conditions with a relative threshold based on regions, but not based on relative thresholds that would relate to sort of past climatology periods to find a heat wave that is unusual for today's time, right? So that is sometimes also done as to compare to the last 30 years. So you can see here some examples from Northern and Southern Hemisphere, and you can see how different it is for the different examples to find sort of the hottest season or the hottest period in those cities and define what the temperate and the hot conditions are. So that's sort of the first challenge. The second challenge is populations differing in tools to buffer against heat effects on psychology and physiology. So circumstances like the fact that in the US, almost 80% of populations in many, many cities have access to AC, which is almost never seen in Europe, for example. Like the way that materials for buildings differ between different, continents in Africa and Australia and Asia and Europe, it's very different. The way that social connections and social support systems work in different regions, and work-life balance being very different in different regions. So preparedness for extreme heat and availability of protection measures varies greatly between regions. And ignoring this adaptation difference risks drawing misleading conclusions. So what we're doing is adding a lot of context and adaptive capacity items to the survey, but also measuring sort of very specific location data like postal codes to merge in data sources that have something like blue-green spaces, building materials, and so forth available. Challenge 3 is how to deal with data gaps and uneven data infrastructure. For example, many regions in the world lack comprehensive data access to finely granular weather data, or at least it's not accessible through sort of global weather services. Location specifiers, we've talked to some experts in some cities where postal codes are not commonly used. House addresses are not very clear. For example, I know from Costa Rica that people still describe a location as 2 streets down from the fire station on the left, second door on the right. So it really varies a lot how people describe these. And the other problem is sort of outages in electricity might be more common in certain areas. That has an effect both for data loss during critical data collection periods, sort of on a random basis, but also data loss or sampling bias due to specifically the climate events, right? Like heat waves might cause electricity problems in certain locations and might cause sampling bias in certain locations if people cannot access their phones or our survey in those times. So there might be a form of structural exclusion that we might have to take into consideration. And to be completely honest, we don't have a good solution for this, but we will try to estimate dropouts very well and track weather patterns and outages with external data sources to make sure we at least monitor this kind of stuff. And finally, challenge 4, I think this is more common across many big team science projects, but for climate measures, we'd specifically need to adapt items related to temperature and climate, thermal comfort, constructs related to climate, because it's sort of the main important issue that we're dealing with, right? And if that's not adapted to local understandings, we might miss sensitivity across the sites. So what we're doing is we're asking local teams in each of the regions to help with the adaptations or getting some help from PSA translators as well. And finally, timing and synchronization in climate exposure projects, data collection aligns not just by calendar, but by climate timing. As you can see, there's very different zones and they have different heat exposure at very different times of the year, which adds a logistical strain to the project coordination. That's sort of on us and we're trying to deal with that, but also adds design complexity. And I think this is really important to have in mind when starting a project like that. We will use an alert system for the different teams to sort of cooperate better and coordinate the timings better, but it's definitely a big challenge as well. But still, from challenge to opportunity, because climate change and these kind of climate phenomena are so widely observed and they are the defining challenge of our time, it's really important to understand cognitive and social consequences. And our project hopes to, is bringing together a lot of researchers, disciplines, collaborators, continents to quantify, understand, and mitigate those effects. We're going to try to sort of outreach to policy to make sure that our findings are well shared. Everything will be open science and open access for people to replicate this. So we're hoping that together we can transform global collaboration into actionable insights for a healthier, more cooperative future. And thanks to, obviously, our team, Mona and Klaus and Kim, of course, as the leads, and Joshua in particular for implementing everything in JS Psych so that it will be easy for everybody to copy our study design, the PSA, and all the experts and many, many more collaborators on the project. We're still looking for funding teams, so if you're interested, you can sign up, you can sign up by emailing us, or if you just want to follow updates, we will update on our website regularly with the status and every new step. Thank you.
Awesome. I learned many new things, and I've heard about this project quite a bit. So we definitely have time for some questions. If folks want to, you can just unmute, feel free to ask, or type them in the chat.
Especially if you have ideas how to help us face some of the challenges that we're facing. If you have any good ideas, any good sort of constructive ways to address them, it'd be great.
I also think Josh is awesome, so +1 for JS side.
I will tell him. He's amazing. He's such a great guy.
One of our MVPs. Maybe while we're waiting, in case somebody is typing, Mona or Celina, we could talk just a little bit more about the timeline, what exactly we're planning, how we're working on that right now.
We can. When it comes to
Tentative timeline.
timeline, when it comes to timeline, we have learned that Celina and I tend to be optimistic, and Kim tends to be what seems as pessimistic turns out to be realistic. So, which is a good thing. So currently we are implementing the survey, like starting to implement everything for the survey. We are also doing some pre-testing already for some of the scales, and we hope to launch 2 pilots in Johannesburg in South Africa and Sydney in Australia, and have them fully before end of this year, and then check that everything works, check that it all, like how the data is stored, that the setup with the panel provider works and all of this. And then ideally this will translate to us kicking off the project and beginning of 26. And then it, of course, fully depends on whether all of the cities will face heat waves. You get a bit of a conflict here, an inner conflict, because of course you don't want 40 cities worldwide to face severe heat waves in 2026. And at the same time, we are expecting to see at least a lot, like a majority of them, to have heat waves, also based on the data from the prior years. And of course, this also is relevant for the data collection. So depending on how many cities we actually have these extreme heat events, let's call it like this, extreme heat events in 2026, this will of course decide if we still need to go on with data collection in 2027.
To be fair, we selected the cities specifically because of their sort of opportunity or possibility to have a propensity to have heat waves, right? So it won't be that surprising if they do end up, if the majority does end up having large heat waves. Valentine from Ghana. I'm a biodata analyst. Are you accepting volunteers to join the project? If you are, can you explain to me how I can get involved? So it depends a little bit. I think in your particular case, are you a senior researcher? Are you an early career researcher? So we're happy to, for non-funded teams, which I'm expecting you are, since you didn't write that you can fund, early career researcher. Yeah, so perfect for both early career researchers and collaborators from underfunded regions. So non-weird countries, to be exact. We are totally happy to accept volunteers. I think Mona will, if you write us at the email that I sent before, it's Heat and Cognition, right? I'll put it in the...
I put it in the chat already. Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
It's I think writing to this email, you're faster than me. Writing to this email helps a lot for us to then match you also, because we do have a team in Ghana. So we could also, maybe you could support them with the local adaptation, with the testing of the links. We can definitely check to find a role for you there.
Maybe you can fill out, Mona, maybe you can send the survey to Valentine as well, and then we have like a mini survey for volunteers, what they can or what they prefer to help with, and then we allocate you based on on that. And I mean, if you're a data analyst expert already, it might also be fun to get more involved in that side, if that's your expertise.
Sweet. All right. Well, thank you guys very much. The link for this, if you came in late, will be available after the conference. And since I am doing these all day, I'm going to tell you guys awesome job and see you in the next session in 4 minutes.
Thank you so much, Erin.
Of course. Y'all have a good one.